Hello, friend. Thanks for joining me for another book chat. Today, let's spend a few minutes with The Greater Trumps by Charles Williams. This work of metaphysical fantasy was originally published back in 1932. Now, I previously read a couple of other books by Charles Williams. I read Descent into Hell and War in Heaven. And Charles Williams wrote this kind of metaphysical or religious fantasy, religious in the sense of based around mythology or usually Christian type frameworks. War in Heaven was essentially a Grail type story. And Descent into Hell had characters like Lilith, there was a succubi, and there was even a doppelganger. Yeah, so I will link to the chats for those books down in the details below. But what is this one about anyway? The Greater Trumps by Charles Williams. This was set in England. It's set in about the time that it was published, meaning around like 1932. And our main characters, we have Lothair Coningsby is a middle-aged man who lives this really comfortable, middle-class, stable life with his never-married sister Sybil and his two grownish children. Nancy is his daughter and his son, I'm blanking on his name. But anyway, Lothair is really rather stuffy. He's kind of a typical middle-class, set in his ways, crotchety, bourgeois type of man. Sybil, though, in some ways, his sister, is his opposite. She is what I would describe as enlightened. She has a calmness to her that really radiates divinity or enlightenment to me, and to really, I think the other characters around her notice this about her, are sort of drawn to her usually for this reason. Lothair's daughter is Nancy is engaged to a young lawyer named Henry Lee, and Lothair likes him okay, but he's kind of suspicious of him because he seems obviously to have come from the Romani people, right? Lothair calls him Gypsy, the Gypsies. And Lothair has inherited recently, I think fairly recently, some antique playing cards, among them some tarot cards. And Henry, Nancy's fiancé, is there visiting her at one point and sees the cards and notices something about one of the tarot decks that's very unusual. And it turns out this deck is not an ordinary tarot deck. He thinks it is actually the original tarot deck. So, like I mentioned, Lothair is sort of this crotchety, somewhat stingy man, and he won't give away the cards or sell the cards, especially now that he knows that Henry's interested in them and wants them. So Lothair, though, really wants to get his hands on these cards. And he decides to use Nancy, his fiancée, to try to get the cards. And he does this by inviting Nancy and her entire family down to his grandfather's house for Christmas. His grandfather lives somewhere south of London. And so everybody agrees to go. Lothair, his sister Sybil, Nancy and her brother, and obviously Henry. So as it turns out, though, Henry's family, we learn, have been searching for this particular set of tarot cards for centuries and centuries. They have a device in their possession which has also been handed down for centuries and centuries, that when paired with the cards could actually open the doors to all sorts of knowledge and really power. And I won't go into this device too much, this sort of mystical device, because I think it would detract from like a first-time reader's experience with the book. I found it really interesting to find out what this device was. And so I will just say that my interpretation of this device is that it's a miniature model of the cosmos. And by cosmos, I don't mean the galaxy, the universes and the galaxies and the planets. I mean the whole cosmos, meaning everything that is and all the movements of all the planets, all the nebula, all the stars, down to all the movements of humans, animals, continents, the wind, the weather, so everything, clouds, is contained in this model. I interpreted it to mean that. So just to round out all the major characters, Henry's grandfather's name is Aaron, and he has a sister, Joanna. That's this kind of wild woman that wanders the countryside with this not too intelligent young man. And she thinks she's Isis, and she's looking for, I believe, the pieces of Osiris. I'm not sure what that was all about, to be honest with you. You know, this book could probably use a reread from me at some point in the future. I have only read it just this one time. But this character, she's a bit off the wall. But anyway, those are the main characters and the main central plot, which is these cards and Henry and his grandfather's attempts to get the cards so that they can work with the cards with this device that they have. So just some thoughts and themes around the book. The book was pretty unusual, as I mentioned. I'm sure it would, like I mentioned also, it would do with a good rereading because there seems to be a lot there, and there's a lot there under the surface. And the Greater Trumps actually refers to the major arcana of the tarot deck, and I feel like there's some symbolism probably in this book that I didn't get on the first reading that I might get on another reading. So there's that to consider for a future read. You know, but what I basically think that the book was trying to say, at least that I took away from it, was, let's start with Lothair's occupation. He is described as being a warden of lunacy. And I'm not exactly sure what a warden of lunacy is, if it's the warden of a lunatic asylum. It doesn't really go into too much specific about what a warden of lunacy is. So I feel like this is sort of like a symbol of the lunacy, the warden of the lunacy, of the sort of stable, materialistic, day-to-day, mundane world that is really solidly materialistic, and a person who is not able to see beyond that into the sort of the greater forces that are at work in the cosmos. Whereas Sybil, his sister, as I mentioned, seems to be his opposite and seems to be quite enlightened. And I think this is illustrated in this quote really well from the book. The quote says, "A fanatic in a train who had given her a tract, 'Love God or go to hell.' It was only after a number of years that she had come to the conclusion that the title was right, except perhaps for 'to go,' since the truth would have been more accurately rendered by 'be in hell.' So love God or be in hell." And so this idea of love, and the sense of love, the power of love or the force of love being actually the divine, is the presence of the divine, is runs actually throughout the book. Sybil lets this divine flow through her. Although she's hesitant to call this deity a god, she does let this power, this love flow through her. She says here, it says here in the book, a quote, "She was also doubtful about God. Love would have been sufficient by itself, but it was necessary at first to concentrate on something which could be distinguished from all its mortal vessels. And the more one lived with that, the more one found that it possessed in fact all the attributes of deity." So she's saying love, this force of love, once it's fully encountered, would be sufficient in and of itself, but that this language requires there to be a term outside of that, meaning outside of an individual, meaning encompassing more. And so she gets comfortable with the idea of deity. So I thought Sybil was actually one of the more interesting characters in the book. She doesn't need to try to know the future. In fact, at one point when they're experimenting with the cards earlier in the book, with telling the future, like the tarot cards are known to be able to do. Sybil says, she doesn't care about that. Like they asked, they want to try to tell her fortune, and she says, why would I want that? Like she has no interest in that because she's at peace with sort of the divine presence as is. There's another quote here that sort of illustrates that as well. It had struck her that there was no need for her to try or to enjoy. She had only to be still and let that recognized deity, love, itself enjoy, as its omnipotent nature was. She still forgot occasionally, her mortality still leapt rarely into action and confused her and clouded the sublime operation of it meaning the divine power of love. So, but as I mentioned, most people live in this lunacy, right? They live, as that first quote mentioned, in hell because they live in the absence of this divine love or our love. And so they do want to know the future. They do want to try to control it because they're apprehensive of it and control these events through really any means necessary. And all hell eventually breaks loose in this book with these cards and this device and the attempts by some of the characters to manipulate events through them. And the book may go a little off the rails there at the end when we're really getting to the climax of this effort, but I did still find it quite enjoyable. So I think I will leave the chat of The Greater Trumps by Charles Williams with that. I did enjoy this, and I will be reading more Charles Williams. There's still several of his books that I would like to get to at some point, so I'll have more Charles Williams coming up in the future. But my next read is going to be, let me just call up the book cover. It is going to be Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott, and I have finished this already, so I will have a chat on it coming up soon. Until next time, take care.